This week we are studying chapters 28 and 29 of 1 Samuel. We see in the previous chapters leading up to 28 and 29 both the good and the bad in David. In chapter 24 we see David sparing Saul's life. In chapter 25 we see how just the opposite extreme of that, David's willingness to slaughter innocent men when he is dealing with Nabal, and is kept from that by Abigail, who later becomes his wife. We see in chapter 26 again David sparing Saul's life for a second time. Then in chapter 27 we see David again seemingly on the opposite end of this spectrum of behavior and attitude, David joining with the Philistines, Israel's arch enemy, and murdering innocent men, women, and children. It's important I think, to point out all of this behavior of David and how the events that have led up to this, him running from Saul continually with his army of 600 men in the wilderness, and how that over time has had its effect on David. It's important to point this out to make the application of how stressful that situation was in David's life, but yet how that was preparing him to serve as God's leader of the nation of Israel. We see here God pointing out to us in Scripture the failures of men who are held up as icons of faith in Scripture, yet we see their sin. God never shies away from showing us their weakness and their sinfulness. And we see this in David. We see both the good and the bad of David in all these chapters leading up to where we are in chapters 28 and 29. And even further into David's life, we see as he was king of Israel, we'll see the mistakes that he's made then as well. Chapters 28 and 29 bring us up to the end of Saul's reign that we'll read about in chapter 31, and shows us how really God is in control of all of these events. Saul's complete rejection by God, causing him to consult the medium or witch at Endor. These were the very people Saul had rejected and banished from the land. In the beginning of chapter 28, we read in verse 3, it talks about Saul banishing those mediums or spiritists from the land. And then we find him, after realizing God is not answering him, God is not coming to him to answer his prayers, that he feels like he's forced to go to the very ones that he's banished from the land. The thing about that encounter with this medium at Endor is almost amusing. Notice the complete surprise and terror of the medium as Samuel actually appears, pointing to the fraudulent nature of this practice. I think that's an important point to make when you're going through this text with the students, that this medium, who supposedly called up the dead all the time and had the ability to do this, actually was frightened when Samuel actually appeared. We need to point out and draw an application from Samuel's question of Saul in verse 16. Since Saul had rejected God, we see God completely rejecting Saul. And that was Samuel's question. Why have you sought me, seeing that God has rejected you? The application I think that should be made here is that we can reach a point in our life in a departure from God that he will give us up. He will depart from us. You can go to Romans chapter 1 and verses 26 and 28 and point that out. That might be a good reference to use at this point in the text. Chapter 29, we see David being rejected by the Philistines, who don't trust him to go into battle with them against Israel, his own people, which would be a very natural fear for them to have. He's an Israelite, a very well-known, well-respected Israelite. Only the king of the Philistines, Achish, at this time trusted him. No one else did. No one else trusted him to go into battle with them. But we see this rejection by the Philistines really sets up his return to Israel after hearing the news of Saul and Jonathan's death in chapters 30 and 31. So chapters 28 and 29 bring us to the end of this period of David's life where he has been running from Saul and hiding from Saul in the wilderness. I think it's important to point out that this is not just a period of a few weeks or maybe a month. This has been a years-long process that we've been reading about in these chapters leading up to the end of 1 Samuel, where David and his men are running from Saul. Possibly as much as 20 years or more that this has been happening. We need to make that point and drive that home with our students that this has been a long process, and how that has had its effect on David throughout the years of his being in the wilderness, living that kind of life, having to provide for these 600 men. Talk about how difficult that must have been, and how David has departed from God at times and had sinful attitudes and involved himself in sinful activities, murdering people, innocent people. Yet God still has favor on David and still shows his favor on David, because God knows David's true heart, just as he knew Saul's true heart. And we see the end result of that really illustrates the difference between Saul and David. I think it's important to bring that out as well. Thank you.